What does a person see in the first 90 seconds of meeting you that takes everyone else 90 days to notice? There is a moment just before something is taken from you when nothing appears to be happening at all. No raised voice, no sudden move, just a question asked at exactly the right time. A silence held 2 seconds too long, a person who seems to already know how the conversation will end before you've decided how to begin it. The colleague who never loses an argument, not because they're the loudest voice in the room, but because they never entered it as an argument to begin with. The relative at a family dinner who can redirect an entire conversation with a single, well-placed question and leave the table wondering how the subject changed. The stranger who becomes a friend faster than seems reasonable, and only later do you notice how much you told them and how little they told you. We tend to imagine danger as something loud, a raised fist, a sudden threat, a wolf's teeth catching torchlight. But in nature, the animals that survive longest are rarely the ones that announce themselves first. The lion roars after the hunt, not before it. The stillest thing in the grass is usually the thing deciding whether you are worth the energy of chasing at all. Strip away the fur and the claws, and the same architecture of mind reappears in boardrooms, courtrooms, marriages, and empires. Not a creature, a cognitive style, a way of processing the world that prioritizes information over emotion, timing over impulse, and leverage over confrontation. Psychologists have a dry, clinical vocabulary for the traits involved. Historians have 100 names for the men and women who used them to build and dismantle nations, but the people who actually live this way rarely think of themselves as unusual. They think of themselves as simply awake, as if everyone else is negotiating with a blindfold on, and they alone removed theirs. This is not a documentary about criminals, though some criminals will appear in it. It is not about villains, though the word will be tempting more than once. It is about a mind, a specific architecture of attention, patience, and control that has existed since the first primate discovered that a display of strength cost more than the appearance of one. Why does the calmest person in the negotiation usually win it? Why do the most dangerous minds in history so rarely raise their voice? What does a person see in the first 90 seconds of meeting you that takes everyone else 90 days to notice? And if that last question unsettles you, it is worth asking yourself honestly whether it's because you have been on the losing end of it, or because some part of you already knows exactly what it feels like to be the one doing the noticing. By the end, you may recognize someone you have worked for, someone you have loved, someone you have feared without ever being able to explain exactly why. You may also recognize yourself. No infant enters the world calculating, but somewhere between the crib and adulthood, a small number of people develop a fundamentally different relationship with their environment than everyone around them. And the question of why has occupied psychologists for a century without producing a tidy answer. Start with the oldest argument in the field, nature against nurture. It is the wrong frame. What the evidence actually points to is closer to a keyhole than a coin flip, a narrow range of inherited temperament present from birth that becomes something specific only when it passes through a particular kind of environment. Every trait discussed in this film is, at its root, a story about adaptation. Not adaptation in the vague self-help sense of the word, but the older, colder biological one. A trait persists because it once solved a problem, not because anyone judged it good or bad. The mind we are describing did not appear in order to make anyone suffer. It appeared because somewhere in a specific life, in a specific environment, it worked. Some infants, it turns out, are born with a lower baseline reactivity than others. Their heart rate barely shifts at a loud noise or an unfamiliar face that sends other infants into visible distress. Psychologist Jerome Kagan spent decades tracking this trait through childhood and into adulthood, and what he found was unsettling in its simplicity. Low, reactive children grow up less afraid of novelty, less rattled by conflict, and more willing to walk directly into a situation that would send a more reactive child running the other way. Fearlessness, on its own, is not predation. It is raw material, nothing more. What shapes that raw material is inconsistency. Children raised in genuinely unpredictable environments where affection and punishment arrive on no discernible schedule, where the rules of a household shift with a parent's mood, rather than a child's behavior, develop a heightened, almost obsessive sensitivity to environmental cues. They learn to read a room before they can read a sentence. Not because anyone taught them to, because the alternative was getting hurt, and a nervous system that learns this lesson early does not simply forget it once the danger passes. Competition does the rest of the work. Long before children compete for anything that matters to the adult world, they compete for something that matters enormously to their own. A parent's attention, divided unevenly among siblings, awarded inconsistently, and never quite sufficient to go around. Researchers studying sibling relationships have found that children become remarkably sophisticated strategists inside this small arena, years before they show any comparable sophistication anywhere else in their lives. Who to align with, who to provoke, which behavior earns notice and which earns none at all. It is a rehearsal space most people forget entirely by adulthood. Some people never stop running the drills. Consider, too, that we are a status species long before we are anything else. Every human hierarchy, corporate, criminal, academic, romantic, echoes the same evolutionary tournament our primate ancestors ran for food, territory, and mates. Primatologists studying chimpanzee troops have documented, again and again, that raw physical dominance rarely wins the top position alone. The individuals who reach and hold alpha status are usually the ones who build coalitions, time their challenges precisely, and know exactly when to display strength and when to conceal it entirely. Researchers gave this phenomenon a name worth remembering: the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. The theory that primate brains, including ours, grew as large as they did not primarily to solve problems with the physical world, but to solve problems with each other. So the predator is not created by trauma alone, nor by genetics alone, nor by hierarchy alone. It is created by the collision of all three: a nervous system that does not panic, an environment that rewards vigilance, and a species-wide inheritance built for social competition. And here is the detail that separates this film from a diagnosis. None of these ingredients are rare. Millions of people carry some combination of low reactivity, early inconsistency, and status awareness. Only a small fraction of them become what the rest of this film will examine. The rest become something else entirely: surgeons who stay steady when a patient is bleeding out, negotiators who talk hostages out of buildings, leaders who hold a room together at the exact moment it wants to fall apart. The raw materials of the predator and the raw materials of the protector are disturbingly often identical. What differs is not the mind, it is the direction it has been pointed in. Ask most people what happened in a conversation, and they will tell you what was said. Ask a certain kind of person the same question, and they will tell you what was said, what was carefully avoided, how long the pause lasted before the answer finally came, and what the answer would have been if the other person hadn't caught themselves in time. This is the first real distinction. Most human beings process conversation as content. A small minority process it as data. There is a popular myth worth dismantling here, because the truth underneath it is more interesting than the myth. For decades, pop psychology has insisted that master manipulators are elite lie detectors, reading a flicker of the eyes, a micro-expression lasting a 40th of a second, that tells that film and television love to dramatize in slow motion. The research does not support this. In one of the largest analyses ever conducted on deception detection, spanning tens of thousands of individual judgments, psychologists Bella DiPolo and Charles Bond found that the average person, and even trained professionals like customs officers and interrogators, could distinguish truth from lies barely better than a coin flip, somewhere around 54% accuracy. The confident, all-seeing lie detector is overwhelmingly a fiction. So what actually separates the people who seem to see through everyone? Not superhuman perception in a single instant. Patience across many instances. The technique is called behavioral baselining, and versions of it are taught in hostage negotiation courses and structured interviewing programs. The idea is almost insultingly simple. Before you can spot a lie, you need to know what the truth looks like on this specific person. How they sit when they are relaxed, how quickly they normally speak, where their eyes go when they are remembering something real, as opposed to constructing something false. Only after establishing that baseline does any single deviation mean anything at all. This is why the practiced mind so rarely reacts to one data point. One nervous laugh means nothing. One avoided glance means nothing. What matters is the pattern across 10 conversations, 10 decisions, 10 moments when a person had the option to tell the truth and chose something more convenient instead. There is a second, quieter distinction hiding underneath all of this, and it belongs to psychology rather than to any spy manual. Researchers separate empathy into two distinct systems that do not always travel together. Cognitive empathy is the ability to accurately model what another person is thinking and feeling, to build a working map of their inner life. Affective empathy is the capacity to actually feel some version of what they feel alongside them. In most people, the two systems run in tandem, reinforcing each other, but they are dissociable, and researchers studying personality have found individuals in whom the map remains fully intact, sometimes unusually sharp, while the felt experience underneath it runs thin. This may be the single most important fact in this entire film. The ability to read people with total accuracy and the capacity to be moved by what you read are not the same faculty, and one can exist in near total absence of the other. Reading incentive follows a related logic. Economists use a useful concept called revealed preference, the idea that what people actually choose under real constraints tells you more about what they want than anything they claim to want. A business partner who insists trust matters more than money, and then quietly restructures a deal in his own favor. The moment the numbers grow large enough, has revealed his actual hierarchy of values without saying a word about it. Most people politely ignore this kind of evidence because confronting it is socially expensive. The practiced mind does not ignore it, it simply files it away, indefinitely, without comment, for later. Reading inconsistency works on a similar principle, though it points inward as often as it points outward. Psychologist Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance showed that human beings will unconsciously reshape their own memories and justifications to keep their self-image intact whenever their actions and their stated values drift apart. Most people never notice the drift happening inside themselves, because the mind performing the reshaping is the same mind meant to catch it. A more practiced observer extends no such courtesy to others. The gap between what someone claimed about themselves last year and what their choices actually said this year is, to this kind of mind, one of the most reliable instruments available, precisely because almost nobody thinks to manage it. And then there is the reading of weakness, the part of this process that makes people most uncomfortable, because stated plainly, it sounds cruel, but weakness, in this context, rarely means frailty. It means asymmetry, the place where someone wants something more than they are willing to admit, or fears something more than they are willing to show. A founder desperate for validation, an executive terrified of being seen as indecisive, a partner who cannot tolerate silence and will say almost anything to end it. Everyone carries asymmetries like these. They are not moral failures. They are simply the parts of us that have not finished growing yet. The difference between a good therapist and a con artist, when both notice the exact same asymmetry in the exact same person, is not perception. It is intention perception. In other words, is never the dangerous part of this story. What a mind decides to do with what it sees, that is where the story actually begins. Every mind that operates this way relies on a small set of instruments, refined over a lifetime, that look unremarkable from the outside and are almost impossible to defend against from the inside. The first is patience, and it is stranger than it sounds. In the animal world, biologists draw a sharp line between pursuit predators and ambush predators. A cheetah spends itself entirely in one spectacular 10-second sprint. A crocodile spends weeks doing nothing at all, positioned a few inches beneath the surface, waiting for a single mistake it never had to cause. Human strategists overwhelmingly resemble the crocodile. The marshmallow experiments conducted by psychologist Walter Mischel in the 1960s found something that still holds up in modified form under modern replication. The ability to delay gratification in early childhood correlates with a striking range of later life outcomes. Patience is not a virtue in this world. It is a form of leverage that compounds silently while everyone else spends their advantage the moment they feel it. Timing depends on patience without being identical to it. Timing is the decision of exactly when to convert stored patience into action, and the strategic mind treats that decision with something close to reverence. Sun Tzu, writing on warfare more than 2,000 years ago, returned again and again to a single idea, that the greatest victories are the ones achieved by acting only once an opponent's position has already collapsed under its own weight, rather than by force applied too early. Modern military doctrine still teaches a version of the same principle through the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, developed by fighter pilot and strategist John Boyd. The insight travels well beyond combat. Whoever moves through that cycle faster, with better information, does not need force at all. They simply arrive at the decision point first, while their opponent is still observing. Emotional control is the weapon most often mistaken for coldness. It is not the absence of feeling. Neuroscience draws a distinction between the amygdala, the brain's rapid threat detection system, ancient and reflexive, and the prefrontal cortex, which arrived far later in our evolutionary history and specializes in inhibiting exactly those reflexes when they are unhelpful. Psychologist Daniel Goleman popularized the term amygdala hijack. For the moment, the older system overrides the newer one, and most people, most of the time, live at the mercy of that hijack. What looks like supernatural calm under pressure is frequently nothing more mystical than a well-exercised prefrontal cortex. A mind that has practiced thousands of times the split-second choice to observe a feeling rather than obey it. The Stoics arrived at the same insight without an MRI machine. Marcus Aurelius filled an empire's worth of private notebooks, reminding himself that an event carries no verdict of its own. Only the mind's reaction to it does. Strategic silence follows naturally from emotional control, because silence only works on a mind that is not compelled to fill it. Negotiators train explicitly for this. A pause held 2 or 3 seconds beyond what feels comfortable creates a vacuum, and most people are constitutionally incapable of tolerating a conversational vacuum. They will pour information, concessions, and anxiety into it just to make it stop. The practiced mind has simply unlearned that discomfort. Silence, to this kind of thinker, is not emptiness. It is an invitation for someone else to keep talking, and people rarely reveal as much as they do while nervously trying to fill a quiet room. Then comes the harder distinction, the one between influence and manipulation, which are built from identical materials and separated only by transparency. Psychologist Robert Cialdini spent a career cataloging the mechanisms that move human behavior: reciprocity, the felt obligation to return a favor; social proof, our tendency to copy the behavior of a crowd; authority, our deference to perceived expertise; scarcity, our disproportionate hunger for what seems limited; commitment and consistency, our need to act in line with choices we have already made publicly. Every advertiser, every fundraiser, every parent negotiating a bedtime uses these same mechanisms. What makes something manipulation rather than influence is not the mechanism itself. It is whether the other person, fully informed of what is happening, would still consent to the exchange. A retailer creating real urgency around genuinely limited stock is using scarcity honestly. Someone inventing a fake deadline to short, circuit your judgment is pulling the identical lever dishonestly. Same key, a very different lock they are trying to pick. Deception operates on a longer game than most people assume. Evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers proposed something genuinely unsettling on this front, that natural selection may have favored a capacity for self-deception, specifically because self-deceived liars are harder to catch. Convince yourself that your exaggeration is basically true, and there is no guilty flicker for anyone else to detect, because as far as your own nervous system is concerned, there is nothing to hide. The most effective deceivers, by this account, are rarely cold calculators reciting careful lies. More often they are people who have already lied to themselves so completely that the lie feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from sincerity. Calculated risk separates the strategic mind from the merely reckless one, and the separation is almost entirely mathematical. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory demonstrated that human beings, left to instinct, weigh potential losses roughly twice as heavily as equivalent gains, a bias that makes most people irrationally cautious in situations that actually favor boldness, and irrationally bold in situations that don't. The strategic mind does not feel less fear in the moment of risk. It has simply trained itself to override the felt asymmetry and calculate the real expected value underneath it. Poker players have a phrase for this: playing the odds, not the cards in front of you. Power and scarcity are close cousins. Social psychologists John French and Bertram Raven identified several distinct bases of power in 1959, and only one of them, coercive power, the power of punishment, requires visible force at all. The others, reward power, legitimate power, referent power built on being liked and admired, and expert power built on perceived competence, can all be acquired and wielded without a single threat ever spoken aloud. Scarcity intensifies every one of them. Make yourself, your attention, or your approval difficult to obtain, and its perceived value rises automatically independent of whether anything about you has actually changed. Psychological pressure and indirect aggression are the tools reserved for open conflict, and they rarely resemble conflict at all. Developmental psychologists studying childhood aggression identified a category decades ago called relational aggression, harm delivered not through fists but through exclusion, rumor, and the strategic withdrawal of approval. It shows up on playgrounds. It shows up, virtually unchanged, in executive suites. The appeal for a strategic mind is deniability. A raised fist can be reported. A slowly cultivated rumor, a meeting you were quietly not invited to, a compliment withheld at exactly the moment you needed it most. These leave no fingerprints, and they are frequently more effective at reshaping someone's confidence than direct confrontation would ever be. Social camouflage ties the toolkit together. Sociologist Irving Goffman described all human interaction as a kind of performance, distinguishing between a front stage, where we manage the impression we give others, and a backstage, where the performance drops entirely. Goffman's insight was that everyone does this, constantly, as the basic price of social life. What separates the strategic mind is not that it performs. It is that it performs consciously, deliberately selecting which version of itself a given room requires, while most people simply default to whatever version feels natural and never examine the choice at all. And beneath all of it sits long-term planning, the trait that ties every other weapon into a coherent strategy rather than a bag of disconnected tricks. Mathematician Robert Axelrod ran a now famous tournament in the early 1980s, pitting dozens of competing strategies against one another in a repeated version of the prisoner's dilemma, a classic scenario from game theory. The strategy that won again and again was not the most aggressive one. It was a startlingly simple approach called tit for tat: cooperate first, then simply mirror whatever the other player did on the previous round. Purely exploitative strategies won in the short term and collapsed over repeated rounds because everyone eventually learned to recognize and punish them. The lesson embedded in Axelrod's tournament is one the most disciplined strategic minds seem to intuit without ever reading the research: reputation. Sustained over time beats domination seized in a single moment. This may be the least cinematic and most important truth in this entire film. The predator who survives is rarely the one who takes the most. It is the one who is never quite caught taking anything at all. This mind does not confine itself to one arena. It migrates. In the corporate world, it rarely looks like ambition the way ambition gets portrayed on screen. No fists on tables, no shouted ultimatums. It looks like the executive who says almost nothing in a meeting and is, for that exact reason, the person whose eventual opinion everyone in the room is quietly waiting for. It looks like the negotiator who opens with a request so large it borders on absurd, not because they expect to receive it, but because it makes the real request, arriving 20 minutes later, sound entirely reasonable by comparison. Negotiation researchers call this anchoring, and it rests on the same bias Kahneman spent decades documenting. Human judgments of value are never absolute, only relative to whatever number arrived first. Professional negotiators formalize this instinct into an entire discipline. Hostage negotiators are trained to spend the opening minutes of a crisis doing almost nothing but listening, reflecting a person's own words back to them, because a person who feels heard becomes measurably easier to move than a person who feels cornered. Diplomats spend entire careers mastering the deliberately ambiguous sentence, precise enough to commit to nothing and vague enough that both sides can claim victory from it. None of this requires deception in the crude sense. It requires an unusually accurate model of what the other side needs to hear in order to say yes, and the discipline to deliver exactly that much, and no more. In politics, the strategic mind often shows up as the aide who never appears in a single headline because visibility, to this kind of thinker, is a cost rather than a reward. Historical strategists, from Cardinal Richelieu to Otto von Bismarck, built and sustained enormous influence over European affairs, largely through the same discipline: outlast a rival's patience, control the timing of information rather than its content, and let other people's ambition do the work of eliminating each other. Long before either man was born, the same instinct filled the imperial courts of Byzantium, the Ottoman palace bureaucracy, and the inner circles of Chinese dynastic rule, environments that rewarded, above almost every other trait, the ability to appear indispensable while never appearing dangerous. Cult psychology offers perhaps the starkest laboratory for these same mechanisms, because cult leaders operate with almost no external constraint on how far they push them. Psychiatrist Robert Lifton, studying coercive persuasion in the mid-20th century, identified a recurring architecture behind it. Manufactured intimacy that arrives faster than trust normally would, a gradual severing of outside relationships capable of offering perspective, and an ever-shifting set of demands that keeps a follower permanently working to earn an approval that never quite arrives in full. None of these mechanisms are exotic in isolation. Every one of them exists, in a far milder form, inside perfectly ordinary relationships. What makes a cult is not a new tool. It is the totality and intensity with which familiar tools get applied, combined with the absence of any outside check on their use. The same architecture, scaled down and slowed down, is the engine behind modern confidence fraud and romance scams, patient incremental trust, building aimed at a single eventual withdrawal, a pattern documented in the millions of cases reported to fraud authorities each year. Elite competitive environments offer a gentler, almost admirable version of the same mind. Professional poker players talk about reading a table the way negotiators talk about reading a room, tracking bet sizes, timing, and the subtle inconsistencies that separate a genuine hand from a bluffed one. Chess grandmasters train for years to calculate not just their own best move, but an opponent's most threatening reply to every option on the board, several moves in advance here. The strategic mind operates inside a fully consented, fully transparent contest, where both sides know exactly what game they have agreed to play. Nobody watching a chess match calls the winner a predator. The underlying mechanism is identical to everything else in this film. Only the consent changes the name we give it. Intelligence and military history are, in some sense, this entire film's founding text. During the Second World War, Allied planners built an enormous fictional army in southeastern England, inflatable tanks, fabricated radio traffic, a phantom invasion force assigned to a real and feared general, solely to convince German high command that the Normandy landings were a diversion from a larger attack that did not exist. The deception, now declassified and extensively documented, worked well enough to hold German reserves in place for weeks after the actual invasion had already begun. Entire military doctrines rest on the same premise Sun Tzu articulated 2,000 years earlier, that the appearance a strategist presents and the reality underneath it are two separate instruments, and a skilled mind learns to control both independently. And then there is the version of this mind that society has agreed to call criminal. History remembers Victor Lustig, a con artist who in 1925 convinced a group of Parisian scrap metal dealers that the French government had secretly authorized the sale of the Eiffel Tower for scrap, and collected a bribe from the winning bidder for the privilege of securing the contract quietly. What made the con work was not cleverness in the moment. It was patience beforehand, weeks spent identifying exactly which officials and businessmen were vain enough and discreet enough to make the lie land. Every mechanism catalogued earlier in this film is present in that single story. Observation, patience, calculated risk. Social camouflage worn as convincingly as an actual government seal. The common thread across every one of these arenas, from the boardroom to the chessboard to the battlefield to the con, is not the presence of cunning. Cunning alone explains nothing. Millions of people are clever. What explains the outcome, in every case, is the willingness to wait for the moment when cunning could be spent at maximum effect, and the discipline never to spend it a single moment before that. Here is the part of the film that stops being about them and starts being about you. Carl Jung spent much of his career developing a concept he called the shadow. Not evil in any supernatural sense, but the sum of everything about ourselves we have decided is unacceptable and pushed out of conscious awareness. The shadow does not disappear when it is repressed. It goes underground. And from there, Jung argued, it does something far more consequential than simply lingering. It gets projected onto other people. The trait you find most viscerally irritating in a coworker, a sibling, a stranger online. Jung's uncomfortable proposition is that the reaction runs disproportionately loud precisely when that trait exists, disowned and unexamined, somewhere in you. Evolutionary psychology arrives at a similarly uncomfortable place from an entirely different direction. Every person alive today is the current endpoint of an unbroken line of ancestors who competed successfully enough for resources and status and mates to reproduce. Not necessarily the strongest, not necessarily the kindest, the ones who, in their specific circumstances, secured enough advantage to pass their genes forward. Somewhere in that inheritance sits the capacity for exactly the toolkit this film has spent an hour describing: patience, deception, calculated risk, the reading of weakness. This is not a minority trait carried by a strategic few. It is baseline equipment. What varies between individuals is not possession of the toolkit. It is how much upbringing, circumstance, and personal choice have kept it sheathed. Economists have found something that fits neatly alongside this inheritance, and it explains why the competition never really ends even once basic survival is secured. Studies of relative status, popularized by economist Robert Frank, consistently find that people care less about their absolute standard of living than about their standing relative to those around them. Offered a choice between a smaller house in a neighborhood of larger ones or a larger house in a neighborhood of smaller ones, most people choose the second, even when the first would leave them objectively wealthier. Status, in other words, is not a side effect of the competition. For most human minds, it is the competition, running quietly beneath every decision that looks. On the surface, like it is only about money or comfort or love. Sigmund Freud, writing in the aftermath of a war he found almost impossible to explain any other way, proposed that civilization itself functions as a suppression mechanism, an elaborate necessary agreement to trade raw instinct for collective safety. Laws, manners, the entire architecture of politeness, all of it exists because the unmanaged alternative would be considerably closer to the world nature actually produced. Freud thought the trade was worth making. He also thought its cost was permanent and quiet, a low hum of restlessness that never fully resolves, because the instincts being managed never actually leave the building. Friedrich Nietzsche is the philosopher most frequently misquoted in service of this exact subject, which makes precision worth the effort. His concept of the will to power was not primarily a claim about crushing other people. It was a claim about the fundamental drive underneath all living behavior toward growth, mastery, and the overcoming of resistance, a force that can express itself as cruelty in a tyrant or as discipline in an artist revising a single sentence for the 10th time. Nietzsche's genuine warning was not that this force exists in everyone. It was that pretending it does not exist in you is its own particular danger, because an unacknowledged drive does not grow weaker for being denied. It becomes unsupervised. This is where self-deception returns, aimed inward this time instead of outward. The uncomfortable implication of Trivers's research, not only that skilled liars deceive themselves in order to deceive others more convincingly, it is that this same mechanism is running quietly in almost everyone, almost all the time, justifying the convenient version of events and burying the inconvenient one, long before any external audience is ever involved. The story you tell yourself about why you really said that thing, skipped that obligation, took credit for that idea. How much of it would survive an honest cross-examination? Identity plays its own quiet role here, because most people build their sense of self around the version of them that shows up in comfortable conditions, and rarely audit the version that shows up under real pressure, real scarcity, or real threat. The two are not always the same person, and the gap between them tends to surface only in exactly the moments a person is least prepared to examine it. None of this is an argument that everyone is secretly a predator wearing a disguise. Most people, most of the time, direct this inheritance toward entirely ordinary, entirely defensible ends: protecting a family, winning a fair negotiation, reading a room well enough to know exactly the right thing to say at a funeral. The instinct itself carries no verdict. It is simply present, running beneath the surface of every calm decision you have ever made under pressure, whether anyone ever called it strategy or not. The question this film actually wants to leave with you is not whether you possess this capacity. You do. Everyone who has ever read a room, held a silence, or waited for exactly the right moment to speak is running some version of the architecture. This film has spent an hour describing. The question is what you do the next time you notice it operating. Whether you look directly at it, the way Jung insisted we eventually must, or whether you do what most people do, and quietly, comfortably look away. Go back for a moment to the room this film began in, the one where nothing appeared to be happening. You know what to look for there now. The silence held a beat too long. The question asked at exactly the right moment. The person who seemed to already know how things would end before anyone else had finished, deciding how to begin docked somewhere in that room. A decision was made long before it was announced. That is the part most people never learn to see, no matter how many times it happens to them. Perhaps you are already replaying a room of your own, a negotiation, a relationship that ended in a way you never fully understood, a friendship that always seemed to run on someone else's schedule. Play it back now with everything you know, and watch how differently it reads. Here is what this film cannot tell you, because no film can, which room you are standing in right now, and which chair you are sitting in. Somewhere today, you sat across from someone and felt unusually at ease, a comfort that arrived faster than comfort normally does. A sense of being understood before you had finished explaining yourself. It is worth asking quietly whether that ease was earned the slow way trust is supposed to be built, or whether it was produced deliberately by someone who studied this same architecture of the human mind long ago and simply decided which side of it to stand on. And somewhere today, someone else likely felt that exact same ease sitting across from you. It is worth asking which answer you are hoping for,